Believe it or not, there was a time in gaming before the internet, before smartphones, before social media, and before sites like YouTube and Twitch and Twitter started to infect our lives. And at that time, the hobby of gaming and the joy we had discussing our favorite video game opinions with our friends in real life was at the forefront of our experience. And let me tell you, as somebody who lived through it, it was a wondrous time to be a game fan. Now, as we know, over the course of the past 15 or so years, that kind of digital world and digital infrastructure of the internet and social media and the smartphones in our pockets and the YouTube channel I'm even talking to you through right now started to become totally enmeshed in the hobby and the industry of gaming. And while it did bring some positive benefits that we all get to enjoy, again, me having a YouTube channel being one of them, there are a lot more negative impacts created in the wake of the internet and smartphones and social media being a part of the gaming experience. I, as a very nostalgic person that many of you know, want to kind of revisit and explore and discuss what I think is maybe the last truly great video game generation for a variety of reasons. We're talking about the quality of the consoles and the games being made in the industry itself, as well as the fact that it existed in a pure time before this digital noise that I'm talking about. And to me, in only my personal opinion, that would be the sixth generation. Now, of course, there are years and years and decades and generations of gaming, even before the sixth generation, that also existed before that kind of digital noise that I'm calling it started to, I'm just going to use the word infect the hobby in the industry of gaming. My personal favorite gaming generation of all time happens to be the 16-bit generation, where the big war between Nintendo and Sega and the Genesis versus the Super Nintendo was all the rage, and it kept us so focused and engaged in just the hobby. It was also a growing hobby and a growing industry at the time, so there was a more organic feel to the way everything started to get bigger and bigger, and games got more exciting, and graphics got better, and our possibilities of what we thought could even be achieved just started to grow exponentially. But beyond even that era, like I said, I want to kind of refocus back in on the sixth generation of gaming, which of course is the PlayStation 2, the Nintendo GameCube, the original Xbox, and we can't forget the Sega Dreamcast. All four of those consoles make up the sixth generation. In my opinion, as I said, the last truly great gaming generation. Now, make no mistake, a very strong case could be made for the seventh generation, that being the Xbox 360, the Nintendo Wii, and the PlayStation 3. And boy, oh boy, do I love the seventh generation. I have wonderful memories of that era. And I love all three of those consoles. I'm a huge fan, and I even still play Wii games via my Wii U today. So I feel like, you know, based on your age or maybe just your experience and time playing video games, there's a great chance that you might be someone who thinks the seventh generation was the last great generation. And while it's not what I would call the last truly great generation, I would understand it enough to just totally accept that as a valid response, because I love it. And that transition to HD for the 360 and PS3 was so exciting, and some phenomenal games were released across all three of those consoles, not the least of which are two of my favorite video games of all time, that being Super Mario Galaxy and The Last of Us on the PlayStation 3. But I think the seventh generation also represented the beginning of what I'm going to very melodramatically call the downfall of gaming in a way, because that's when the internet, and yes, I'm putting almost the full weight of the issues on today's gaming industry on the internet. The seventh generation is where the internet started to play more and more of a vital role and become so tangled and integrated and woven into the infrastructure and the culture of gaming in such a way that it started to ruin things. You know, even the creation of things like Xbox Live and PlayStation Network, that's when, you know, YouTube was starting to take off. All these things that, again, have positive benefits. The negative benefits that would eventually come from those things started in the seventh generation, even though they weren't bad at the time, and they were all new and exciting and actually doing good things for gaming at the time. The simple fact that this infectious disease of the internet we live in nowadays began in that time is something that I personally kind of hold against it. It was no one's fault. It just was the beginning of creating a monster that we now have to deal with today. But instead, I want to come back to the sixth generation. Again, the PlayStation 2, the GameCube, the Xbox, and the Dreamcast. Now, everyone's experience and opinions and preferences on gaming in many ways has to do with their age. And as I mentioned, you guys know I'm a very nostalgic guy. I'm also an old man. I was born in 1980. So that means that when the Dreamcast came out in 1999, I was 19. PlayStation 2 came out in 2000, I was 20. And when the GameCube and Xbox came out in 2001, I was 21. So those are very specific years of whatever age you might have been to be experiencing your games. And I feel fortunate that that was kind of a good kind of coming of age era of my life. You know, you're exiting your teens, you're entering your 20s. I was able to drink legally by the time the GameCube and Xbox came out. You know, I was living alone in an apartment with a friend. You know, I had moved out of my folks' house. I wasn't sure what my direction and course was going to be in life, but I was having fun and partying and doing all that great stuff. And at the same time, gaming was taking this incredible leap. We had just gone through the birth of the 3D era a few years earlier with the Nintendo 64 and the PlayStation and Saturn, but now we're going into the next level of that. And obviously, as a huge Nintendo fan, I was enamored with the GameCube. It's one of my favorite consoles of all time. Probably my second favorite video game console of all time. And then, of course, just the thunderous nuclear impact of the PlayStation 2 itself, completely shattering everything we thought was possible in gaming. I think that the success of the PlayStation 2 is actually one of the most important things to talk about and focus on when we kind of revisit and remember the 6th generation, because as we know, even as of today, in 2024, almost 2025, the PlayStation 2 still stands as the greatest and highest selling piece of video game hardware of all time at 160 million units. And I know there's a debate over what's the most accurate, 155 or 160. I don't want to have that debate. The most recent number that's been told to us is 160. We're splitting hairs between 55 and 60 anyway, so I'm just going to go on the 160. If you want to focus on 155, that's fine, because both of those numbers still make it the best-selling console of all time. So again, it doesn't truly matter. But to have sold that well and set such a benchmark with so many video games available to it, so many huge hits, an incredible library of famous games, so many franchises began on the PlayStation 2, to have done that in the early 2000s when the video game industry was only a fraction of the size it is today, is an achievement that we might never see in video games again. Even if the Nintendo Switch, for example, surpasses the PlayStation 2 in hardware sales at the end of the day, which is certainly possible, and I'm 50-50 on if I think it will happen, but it definitely could happen. Even if it does, I actually don't think the Switch's achievement would be nearly as big as the PlayStation 2's, again, because of the era the PlayStation 2 did it in and the size of the industry. It was so much smaller. It was booming. It was growing. It was in its kind of adolescent growth spurt, you could say, but it was so much smaller in terms of the number of people playing and the number of dollars being generated at the time than today. You could argue that it's easier to sell 160 million units of a good video game console in 2024 than it was in 2000, but Sony managed to do it. And I just think that really speaks volumes of their success, and it changed the video game industry forever. Now, something else that I will admit colors my opinion on why I think the 6th gen is the last truly great gaming generation. And I think I say it as somebody who believes it objectively, but I have to at least mention something that goes into my opinion when I say that. And it is the fact that I worked for GameStop as an assistant manager from 2002 to 2005. We had just started taking pre-orders for the Xbox 360 when I left in like the summer of 2005, right? So we were just about to start the 8th generation with the Xbox 360, but through almost the entire 6th generation, you know, the Xbox, GameCube, and PS2 were the main consoles during that time. When I first started in I think it was early 2002, if I remember right, we were still selling Dreamcast games, and we were selling used Dreamcasts for pretty cheap. They were like 50 or 60 bucks at the time. You know, again, this is 2002. We all know Dreamcast was amazing, but it didn't last long, and it exited Sega from the console business, unfortunately. So when I started, Dreamcast was still around, but I think by my second year, I think the Dreamcast had just been vacated completely. But working for GameStop during that era really gave me a good read on the pulse of the gaming industry and the trends and the hobby and people who played video games, because we only talked about video games to each other in person, whether it was me and my coworkers or whether it was the people who would come in as one-offs to buy a video game or a video game console, or the regulars who I would see who would come in just to browse shelves and choose games based off of the cover art and whatever they were looking at for the GameCube or PlayStation 2 or whatever. I mean, again, I talked about this in a recent video as well. There was a time that's how we chose our video games. We weren't looking at our smartphones. We weren't watching trailers and E3 conferences on YouTube and whatnot. We literally were just going to stores and looking at games and reading about them in magazines and making our choices that way. And I had such a great relationship and rapport with both my friends and coworkers, as well as the regulars and people who I saw. And when we weren't so brain rotted from only interacting with people through looking at a screen in the palm of our hand, we had some really good conversations and dissections about the hobby at the time. And that is something, when I think about the purity of gaming in the 6th generation, the greatness of that generation in that era, that's a huge part of it. I was boots on the ground, talking to the man, the person, the consumer, the gamer, the shopper, someone just like me who loved video games so much they would come in and buy a new game every couple of weeks. And I just experienced organically how much people really cared about the hobby at that time. And it's something that, yeah, we all care about it still. Look, I have a YouTube channel because I love gaming today still, and many people do. But isn't it different? I mean, the motivations online are very different for people to talk about or be passionate about games. Not for everybody, but for a lot of people, than they were back then. When you weren't trying to share your passion for gaining anything. It was just because you loved it. And when you came across someone in the wild who felt the same, you had like a kinship. And that was really special, man. And nowadays, we don't have that. Now, to get away from the mushy stuff, let's talk about the practical stuff, which is the games, man. There was so much happening in the world of just creating good video games at the time. The turnaround speed for making huge games was so much quicker than it was today. Even though budgets were obviously large and they were growing for making games, they were small enough that they could release 3, and I mean 3, full-fledged Grand Theft Auto games during that era. They made a couple of Resident Evil games during that era. Nintendo released 2 Metroid games, and they released a new Mario game, and they released, so many amazing things. I mean, there was 2 Zelda games, technically, between the Wind Waker and Twilight Princess, and you could go on and on. Third-party companies were just firing at an all-time pace. When you look at what Capcom or Ubisoft were doing at the time, making multiple Splinter Cell games and making multiple Beautiful Joe games and coming up with new IPs that had a real sincere chance at success. Whether you're talking about Nintendo, Sony, and Microsoft, or if you're talking about the third-party business at the time, so many games, so many IPs began, God of War being one of them. I mean, it just was something truly special. And I don't think we have that same culture nowadays where new IPs can thrive and be created to the same degree that they are now. Budgets are so high that really great games can sometimes be a failure because they didn't sell 20 million copies, which is just obscene. It's a mess nowadays. The practical business dollars and cents side of the industry in 2024, going into 25, is a complete freaking joke. But in the 6th generation, they were making great games, cutting-edge technology, satisfying the gamer, and churning them out at an unbelievable clip compared to what we're doing nowadays. And let me be candid about something. There are still great games being made today. I still love gaming in 2024. I have all 3 consoles. I play them all. There's a lot I'm looking forward to. We have Metroid Prime 4 coming out next year, maybe my most anticipated game in the history of all video games. Knowing that it's real, if I knew Metroid Dread was being made for 7 years, it probably would have been Dread. But Dread was a surprise, right? Even though it was rumored back in the day. When it was actually re-revealed, it was a surprise that that game existed. Metroid Prime 4 we've known about, so I've had 7-8 years of hype, right? So I am like ready for that. And we even do get the occasional new IP, right? Like Ghost of Tsushima is another new IP in the last few years that I love, and I can't wait for Ghost of Yotei, The way the Souls series has evolved over the years. Love it. And I could just list off so many. Cyberpunk is a new IP and a new game that I just think is fantastic. And there's plenty of other ones, there's an Indiana Jones game coming out tomorrow that I'm so excited for. It might be one of my favorites of the year. So I'm trying to make sure that it's known that I still think a lot of good video games come out today. So I'm not trashing video games today to say that there aren't good video games, but I think the industry, the dollars and cents business, the monetization, the way the internet and social media has ruined our conversations and our interactions with each other. Things are so toxic, people are picking sides and they're yelling at each other in the worst ways. Even people just trying to get famous online because the internet allows for them to do it off of like not really genuinely loving video games, but because they can just make a name for themselves. And it's like their passion for gaming isn't driving their passion for gaming. It's their online personality that's driving their passion for making money by being a gamer. Sounds convoluted, but hopefully that makes sense. And so it's another long way to say, back in this 6th generation, when great games were being made, it kept the gamer pure and honest. It kept the industry, pure and honest to a degree. It was still an industry, billion-dollar companies trying to make money off the consumer, but they were doing it in a way that was more about satisfying people to make money than trying to pull the wool over our eyes. And things weren't being monetized in a horrible way. And again, the internet and social media and smartphones weren't brain rotting us when we thought about and played and talked about our favorite games. And on another very personal note, one thing I have to talk about when I talk about the 6th generation in this video is the fact that my #1 favorite video game of all time, Metroid Prime, on the Nintendo GameCube in 2002, released during the 6th generation. So yeah, you want to talk about a little bit of personal bias maybe going into this? You better believe that that's one of them, because that game changed my life, flipped it upside down, and I've talked about this before. I was a big Metroid fan before Prime came out, but I probably would have told you pre-2002, most of my life, that my favorite series was The Legend of Zelda and my favorite game was The Ocarina of Time. But along comes Metroid Prime, and within that first year after completing it and replaying it and not being able to get that game out of my head, I realized, wow, this is the most incredible experience in video game I've ever played, and it still is today in 2024, my favorite game. So, yeah, I love the 6th generation because it also made my favorite game of all time. In fact, still being personal on my opinion here, 2 more of my favorite games of all time were also given to us in the 6th generation. The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker, yeah, that's my favorite Zelda game, maybe my 2nd or 3rd favorite video game of all time. Yes, I was very nervous and shocked and disappointed the first time I flipped magazine pages on a Blockbuster one day and saw the images of the new Zelda looking like a cartoon and not at all being what I wanted or expected. But as time went on and we got closer to release and the reviews came out and then I played it, and at this time I was working for GameStop by the time it released, yeah, I was floored. So to this day, that is still my favorite Zelda game and like in my top 3 video games of all time. The other one would be Resident Evil 4. So 3 GameCube games, right? Resident Evil 4 released in 2005 as an exclusive GameCube game. Back when Nintendo had a 5-game exclusivity deal with Capcom, and Resident Evil 4 was the biggest of them. And that game also flipped my world upside down, changed my life. My favorite Resident Evil game today, and in my top 3 or top 5 video games of all time. Best looking game I'd ever seen at the time. So much fun. So like violent and gory, like popping heads in a way that we'd never done before for not zombies, but the Lost Plog as enemies in that game. And just, man, so much great stuff going on there. Also, there was a small little industry-shaking video game that released in the 6th generation, a small title you might have heard of called Halo on the Xbox. And by the way, in the 6th generation, they released 2 Halo games, to go back to the conversation on how 3 Grand Theft Auto games and 2 Metroid Prime games released in the same generation on the same consoles. They also made 2 Halo games for the original Xbox, something that most companies and console manufacturers couldn't dream of achieving nowadays. Look at Grand Theft Auto 5, man, or the Elder Scrolls 5 Skyrim. It's obscene and embarrassing the way that stuff happens nowadays. But back then, Microsoft dropped Halo to launch their brand new Xbox, their first entry into the video game hardware space, the console space. And while the Xbox had a rough go of it and didn't have a huge library of very successful games, Halo was really all they needed to make a mark, and everyone talked about and played and loved Halo. I mean, look, man, I was in my early 20s drinking and partying with my best friends, living the LAN party life. That was my experience, was going to people's friends' houses with TVs and Xboxes, or having them come to my apartment, or whatever we were doing for years, setting up 3, 4, 5 Xboxes all with our own TVs and 4 people per TV, and just going crazy for an entire night playing Halo that way. It was a revolution. It changed gaming forever for the good. One of the many things that happened in the 6th generation that changed gaming for the good. And, you know, you want to talk about the accolades of this generation, Halo might actually be the biggest of them all. And last but not least, one of the most important things for me to touch on here is the fact that physical gaming was the only way to game at this time. That is so important to me, so important to so many people. And obviously, physical gaming has not completely gone away. It continued into the 7th generation, the 8th generation. It's still available today, but it's important to note when comparing the 6th generation era of gaming compared to today, in 2024, we're only seeing the slow decline of physical gaming alongside the rise of digital gaming. And there are tons of benefits to digital gaming, and I think that we should live in a world where both options, physical and digital, have a chance to thrive and exist forever. The big issue nowadays is that there's plenty of experiences that are relegated to only digital, and I'm not including the indie scene because that is actually a great avenue for indie games to be made available to people, and I like and support that. Not to mention the rise in gaming subscription services like Game Pass, obviously being the big elephant in the room here, the 3-headed monster, so to speak. And, you know, as I've said before in this video and in others, there are benefits and things that I think are good to that, and the fact that it makes the option available. But there was something really special, and there even is still something very special, to going to stores and buying your games and flipping through the books and the backs of the covers and reading everything and seeing the screenshots, holding and owning your game, adding it to a collection. I'm somebody who thinks that when your video game collection is relegated to mostly thumbnails on a screen, a thumbnail for each game you own, whether it's on a console or on a PC, that's way less interesting and exciting to me than actually holding and owning your physical games and putting the complete game, without the need to upgrade or patch or fix things, into your console and playing it that way. Sure, there's more physical effort involved in changing a physical game than just sitting wherever you're sitting and changing it via menus, and that's why I think that, again, there are benefits to both. But when everything was relegated to physical and the internet couldn't allow for companies to release broken games because of that, because they had to ship a complete game on a disc or on a cartridge, it was just better. It was just undeniably better. Yes, more conveniences with digital, but the general overall quality and the culture and the business practices of these companies were all much, much better back in the 6th generation for this reason. And so there are other elements of the 6th generation I could continue to discuss and dissect that I think are good or unique or I have great memories of. I mean, like, let's be honest, the internet did slowly start to become a part of video gaming at the time, because Xbox Live as a service started in that generation for the in their first console outing, the first console to have a hard drive, by the way, too, they released the Xbox Live service for MechWarrior and for Halo 2. There was a modem adapter for the GameCube to play Phantasy Star Online with people. Final Fantasy XI and SOCOM were PlayStation 2 games that released and used the modem adapter to be able to play those games online. Those are very interesting things that happened at that time. And, you know, look, PC gaming was a whole different beast and something I actually think was way better back then than it is today. Nowadays, people play PCs the way they would play home consoles, which is fine, but PC gaming was like, it was physical back then, so we had and stocked physical PC games and had big releases for Warcraft 3 and World of Warcraft and Star Wars Galaxies and the Diablo 2 expansion, I want to say. I can't remember what that was called, but I think that was something that came out when I worked there. And that was a fun time. PC gaming felt more like a viable platform to me at the time, based on... It's still viable today. Let me correct my phrasing there. It's still viable today, but the difference is PC had its own identity. It almost was seen as its own identity, because I don't even know how many video games you could play with a regular controller in your hand on PCs back then. I think people were only playing mouse and keyboard, or at least like 95%. That's how you were playing games. And I actually think that's one of the coolest differentiating factors of playing games on PC now, back then, or at any time. But nowadays, people are playing, you know, Death Stranding releases, and it's like, oh, I'm just going to use a PlayStation or an Xbox controller on my PC to play this game on my PC. And it's like, okay, well, that's fine. And it might even look better because your PC is really powerful, but like, it's the same experience as playing on a console. Back then, if you were going to play World of Warcraft or any game, you had to play it with a mouse and keyboard for most experiences, and that made it unique. And again, I just like the fact that PC games were physical back then. Yeah, it's more convenient with everything digital. Steam is a great, valuable service. I mean, I get it, even though I don't choose to play my games that way. I do get it. But it was so much more pure and sincere and genuine, and the amount of time and effort people put into to go and buy their PC games and take home the discs and install 2 or 3 discs and go through that process at the time. I don't know, it just felt more, you were more connected to the hobby or the PC if that was your platform of choice. You know, I just think that that was something really cool happening at that time anyway. So, anyway, this is really meant to kind of wrap this up and say, for a lot of these reasons, this is why I think that the 6th generation was the last truly great gaming generation. I mean, you know, I touched on a variety of titles and franchises that were relevant at the time. There was so much more than that. You know, I mean, the Sonic Adventure, I didn't talk much about the Dreamcast, which I loved. Soul Calibur was a revolution. The Sonic Adventure games were fantastic. The 2K sports games, holy crap. NFL 2K literally tricked my stepdad into thinking an NFL game was on the TV when it was the off-season. I mean, what? You could never pull that off today, but at the time, that's how realistic it looked and felt, you know, and that was all thanks to the Dreamcast. So it was a great generation because, and I'm harping on this, and maybe a lot of younger people will find this annoying and like, you know, old man yells at cloud kind of stuff, but I don't care. The internet as it is today, social media, smartphones, all this stuff I said, even YouTube and Twitch, it's made gaming worse in my opinion. I just believe it. I don't care if it makes me sound like a curmudgeon. It just objectively has. Are there benefits? Yes. But it has objectively ruined so much more. Whether it's the way we interact with and talk with each other and fight with each other, or whether it's the way the companies in the industry is abusing the internet to monetize the crap out of their games and ruin the quality of games and releasing them in broken states. And things like Concord are only possible to happen in an era where the internet is basically just totally enmeshed in everything gaming. Back in the day before the internet, before smartphones and social media were rotting our brains, it was just better. We interacted and talked with each other in a more genuine, friendly way, and we played our games in a more pure, genuine way. And the companies weren't able to abuse the internet to ruin things. So that's one of the best parts of it. My favorite game of all time, Metroid Prime, released during this generation. Halo released during this generation. New God of War games, 3 Grand Theft Auto games, and the revolution that came with that. You know, new franchises like, Time Splitters or Pikmin came out. The Wind Waker, all these, I mean, I could just go on and just, read a list of all these things, but I just think that everything was better. The industry, our interaction with each other, the quality of games, the amount of games, it was wonderful. So, am I being nostalgic here? Yes. Am I a little bit biased for a variety of reasons, like working for GameStop at the time? Yes. Do I care? No. It's how I feel. And I think that anyone who lived through it can probably really appreciate. You compare 2003 era gaming to 2024, it is night and day, way better 20 years ago than it is playing video games today. So this is just my opinion. This is my stroll down memory lane. And so I think that's about all I have to say for this today. So thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you guys next time on another video.